We are recording the interview of Marine Corps veteran Christopher Martin. This interview is being conducted by Jeremy Tack from the Wright State University Veteran Voices Project. This interview is being recorded at Wright State University in the New Media Incubator. It is 10:25 a.m., November 17th, 2017. Professor Martin, welcome. I will be addressing Professor Martin as Professor Martin because he is my professor in what's the class called?
Quantitative
research. I
That's
drew a blank
one.
there. Strike one. So let's start off with where and when were you born?
I was born in 1972 in Leavenworth, Kansas.
Who were your parents and what were their occupations?
So my father was Nelson Martin. He was actually a high school science teacher, chemistry and physics. He did that until 1976 when he retired and then went back to farming. So I grew up on a family farm in Kansas. My mother she started out as a teacher. That's where they met. She taught English, high school English, and then had kids. And so back then that was not conducive to working and being a young mother at the same time. So she stopped that. And then after we got a little older, she went and became a social worker. And she retired as a social worker in Kansas 5 or 6 years ago.
Mm. So you have siblings?
I do. I'm the youngest of 5, so I have one biological brother, one adopted brother, and then 2 biological sisters. Oldest brother, Joe, is an accountant. My adopted brother, Anthony, lives in Colorado. And then 2 sisters, Laura is a accounts specialist, and then also kind of an accountant. And then my other sister, Betsy, is a social worker.
Do you have any family members that were served in the military as well?
I have, well, none in my immediate family. So I'm the only one in the immediate family. But I've had my grandfather on my mom's side was in the Army for 22 years. He was actually director of the Army Band at Fort Leavenworth, which is why I wound up being born in Leavenworth. And then I had uncles on my dad's side. Well, I guess my uncle on my mom's side too was in the Army for a while. And then uncles on my dad's side that were 2 were in the Navy, 1 was in the Army. The 2 in the Navy served during World War II. And then the younger of those was too young to serve in World War II, so when he joined the Army, it was during the Korean conflict, Korean War period, but he actually didn't wind up going to Korea. He served in Germany.
Okay. So before you joined the Marine Corps, what did you do?
I partied a lot. I was really good at having fun. So I graduated from high school and then went to college for a couple of years where I had a whole lot of fun. And probably too much, which is how I landed in the Marine Corps. Yeah.
So what led to your decision to join the Marine Corps?
Yeah, that's kind of a long story. So in what I called college round 1, the first 2 years, it got to a point where the college and I just kind of came to a mutual agreement that I would not return for my junior year. And so I was working and at the time at a Walmart. I was a valued Walmart associate, kind of a jack of all trades. And so then I was basically making enough money. I was living with my parents. I was making enough money to basically drive back and forth to work. So one day I was driving, it was a Saturday morning. I was driving down to that school that I had attended because my older brother was still going there. And I was going down to visit him and visit friends that, were still going to school there. And I just drove by in Lawrence, Kansas. I was driving through Lawrence. I drove by the recruiting station. It was a standard strip mall, armed forces recruiting, all 4 services in a row. And I just looked over at it and turned the wheel and pulled in the parking lot, walked in the door. And I remember thinking to myself, if I'm going to do this, I've never really challenged myself. So if I'm going to do this, I'm going to go all out. And so I walked in, and it turned out the Marine Corps recruiter was the only one there that day because it was Saturday. And yeah, I walked in and sat down and said, what do I need to do? So that's how it all happened.
What did your parents think?
So I walked in that morning to the recruiter's office. That was a Saturday morning. I was in boot camp 8 days later, which is really fast. And I did not tell my parents until 4 days after I walked into the recruiter's office. I remember we were eating dinner. It was the three of us, my mom, my dad, myself. And I got up from the dining room, I walked in the kitchen to get something, I don't remember what. And I figured, well, now's as good a time as any. So I turned around and I basically made this announcement that I'd joined the Marine Corps and that I was leaving for boot camp in 4 days. And I remember my mother's face was just kind of shock and disbelief. My father was in like mid-bite. He was raising his fork up to take a bite of whatever it was we were eating. And he looked at me and the fork turned and the food just fell off onto his plate. So they were not thrilled. Their experience with the military was through their siblings. So my father had heard stories about World War II. My mother did not have a positive perspective because her brother had served sort of during the 60s and Vietnam War era. And so they were not exactly thrilled about the whole thing. They came around later, though.
How old were you at this time?
I was 21.
What year was this?
1993.
Okay. So where did you go to boot camp at?
San Diego. Went to boot camp in San Diego.
Tell me about that.
Yeah, where to begin? So boot camp, well, I'll start with this. The night before 2 nights before I left. The night before I left for boot camp, you spend in a hotel because you have to get up early and get on the plane the next morning. That was provided by the MEPS station. So 2 nights before, my buddies thought it would be a good idea to give me a send-off. And that was back in the era of VHS video cassette tapes. And so they rented Full Metal Jacket for us to watch. And I remember thinking about halfway through, so if you know that film, the first half of it is Marine Corps boot camp. And I remember thinking about halfway through the first part of that film, I remember thinking, what the hell have I done? Like I don't know how this is going to go. But then the second thought was, well, this is a movie, right? And so this can't be real. This is not exactly, this is stylized. This is blown out of proportion. It's Hollywood. So I got on the plane, I went to the hotel, got up the next morning, got on the plane, flew to San Diego. We got in probably late afternoon. They put us on a bus, had to put our heads down so we couldn't look out the windows, and they proceeded to drive us around for about 2 hours, telling us that we were on our way to boot camp. What I didn't know at the time was that the Marine Corps Recruit Depot boot camp is literally adjacent to the San Diego airport. They share a fence. They're right next to each other. It was just a disorientation thing. They were trying to disorient us. And it worked. And then I remember, they were trying to get it to be dark, nighttime, so that adds to the effect. There were a lot of theatrics in that first night. And, you run out and you stand on the sort of iconic yellow footprints, and it started. Yeah, it started. I've never been screamed at. I had never been screamed at like that before in my life. But that was just the beginning of that. That was pretty tame.
So was it like Full Metal Jacket?
I think minus some of the sort of theatric license taken by Kubrick in that film. Yeah, it was a lot like Full Metal Jacket. I think it's different now. I hear it's a little different now. Not quite. It's maybe a little tamer now. But I remember. So there's a period where they're kind of collecting up people, flying them in from around the country, well, from the west half of the country for San Diego, east half of the country for Parris Island, until they get enough to actually begin a training cycle for your group that goes through. And so I spent about 4 or 5 days, something like that, waiting, essentially what they call a receiving platoon. And I remember thinking, well, this isn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. Not understanding that we hadn't actually begun training yet. That you were pretty disoriented through the whole thing. A lot of sleep deprivation in the first couple of days. And then they sort of gathered us up and marched us over to a new barracks building, and we all went into this giant squad bay, and we sat down on the floor with our legs crossed and our hands, you know, right hand, right knee, left hand, left knee. And we were introduced to our drill instructors. And that was, I'll never forget that day.
Mm-hmm.
I'll tell you that. Yeah.
Do you recall any instructors? Did any of them stand out to you?
John Ballard, Greg Beck, I can't remember the first names, Murillo and Smith. I remember their names. John P. Ballard, drill instructor, Staff Sergeant John P. Ballard, deep South Carolina accent. Greg Beck was force reconnaissance guy. Murillo was a cook, and Smith was standard infantryman. Just mean. They were just mean human beings. But I remember Ballard, the senior drill instructor. I remember thinking that I hated every single thing about that human being. But for some reason I wanted to be like him. And I think that's what they were going for. Yeah, that was, and so I remember them distinctly. Yeah.
Is there any stories during boot camp that you still remember?
Yeah. Let's see. I think another an interesting story is, well, that day when you're, you know, quote unquote, dropped to your training platoon, you're introduced to them, and that is very theatrical. They do this whole introduction thing where they come out individually and they introduce themselves. My name is, and then you get a speech, which is from the senior drill instructor, and during that time, their leadership is sort of standing behind you. So you have a first sergeant and a sergeant major and a lieutenant or a captain who's the platoon commander. And there's this moment where I think it was the platoon commander, somebody back there said, okay, they're all yours. And they turned around and left. And that was the moment when, like, the bomb went off. It was yelling and screaming and get here, go there, do this, you didn't do it right, do it over, dumping foot lockers, knocking over racks. So it was a huge squad bay with 2 rows of iron bunk beds down, you know, racks down each side, and so you had to make your rack in a, you know, military fashion. Nobody ever did it right, so they flipped the whole bunk bed over. And I remember they were screaming at us the whole time, and that lasted probably, I don't know, 6 hours, to the point where Murillo, who was, he was not tall in stature, he was a little guy. He dragged, and I'm 6'5", so he dragged a footlocker over, and this began a recurring theme with us. He would drag a footlocker over and stand on it. Eventually it got to the point where he would make me go get the footlocker and bring it over so he could stand on it and scream at me. And I remember he was screaming, and there were little droplets of blood shooting out of his mouth onto me. And what I think had happened was that he had actually ruptured vocal cords, like literally ruptured vocal cords. And that didn't stop him. He was still screaming, and there was blood shooting out of his mouth. So, you know, once again, I had that thought in my head, what the hell have I done? This is just the beginning. There's, you know, 3 months of this left. Yeah, so that was day one.
How long did it take you to adapt to military life and the Marine Corps life?
Not long, actually. You know, one of the things about military life is it's very structured. You don't really have to think for yourself, particularly in the early stages in boot camp. You don't have to think for yourself. So as soon as you come to that realization, maybe consciously or subconsciously, and then you can, you really just start doing what you're told. The sooner that happens, the better off you are. There were people that never happened for, and some of them didn't make it through boot camp. I mean, there's a pretty high attrition rate for Marine Corps boot camp. Not everybody can do it. So I hit that pretty early and just realized, okay, if I just do what I'm told as fast as I can, then I'll be fine. I also came to the realization that there were times where no matter what I did, it wasn't going to be right. and that was just a technique. That was a tactic they used. And so, well, okay, whatever. I'll just do what I'm supposed to do. Yeah. So, post boot camp, it wasn't as that transition wasn't as difficult. There were times when I would question the method, not question so much as just wonder how I was supposed to do it, the method of training in Marine Corps boot camp, but I could never question the outcome. You were completely, I don't want to say indoctrinated, that's not the right word, but you were formulated in the image of what they wanted you to be and what you needed to be successful, and that was the point of it.
So what was the next step after boot camp?
Well, after boot camp in the Marine Corps at that time, and even today, you get extra boot camp. And so you go to, if you're not going into a combat arms, infantry, artillery, those types of jobs, then you get an extra month, or I don't remember, it was a month or 5 weeks or something like that of infantry training. So I went to the infantry school at Camp Pendleton for infantry training. So that was, we were, of that time, the weekdays we were in the field, the weekends we were in garrison. A little bit of liberty, but mostly just base, restricted to base. So there was a lot of training there, tactical stuff, weapons, patrolling, that kind of thing. After that, I had been selected to become a linguist, and so I jumped on a plane and flew up the coast to Monterey, California, where I reported. Well, actually, I went on boot leave. So the Marine Corps boot camp is so intense that they require you take a small decompression period, 10 days of leave, go home, decompress a little bit, and then report to where you need to be. So I took that boot leave the boot leave happens between, for me, it was between boot camp and infantry school. And then from infantry school, I jumped on a plane, flew up to Monterey, where I reported for duty at the Defense Language Institute.
How was it going home after boot camp?
It was all right. I remember I got off the plane. My mother and my sister came and picked me up, and I got off the plane and jumped in the car, drove back to my parents' house, and the family was all there, and there was going to be a big dinner. Right, welcome home dinner, and served the food, and I just started eating because I was really hungry because I hadn't really eaten. I'd been traveling most of the day. I'd done our boot camp graduation that morning, jumped on a plane, flew. I was really hungry. So I ate, and I didn't realize what was happening until I looked up because I was done with what was on my plate, and I looked up and no one else had started eating. They had just been watching me because in boot camp, you don't have a lot of time to eat. And so one of those sort of, I guess, subconscious things that you're trained to do is eat really fast, which is what I did. And so so that's just an example of just a little bit of how I had to, I guess it's decompression and then readjustment into normal society. I have to suspect it's kind of like coming out of prison. You don't just walk out and you're exactly the same as when you walked in.
All right, so let's talk about the language school. Tell me about that.
That is the single most, I have several degrees. I hold several degrees. I'm well educated. And that is the single most difficult intellectual or academic pursuit I've ever undertaken. I reported there, so I entered the Marine Corps. I joined the Marine Corps in 1993, so right on the heels of the first Gulf War. And I'd been guaranteed a seat for Arabic language, which was the big thing at the time, continues to be the big thing. So what happened was I reported for duty, and it turned out that my seat was no longer available. And so I was reassigned to Korean, so I learned Korean. And the first day we walked into class, it was joint service, so I was sitting in my class were all four services. And we walked in, sat down the first day, the instructor walked in, these are all native speakers. And I remember she just started speaking in Korean.
Mhm.
There was no English for hours and hours. They just kept talking to us in Korean. And again, I had the same thought. What the hell have I done?
Mhm.
Why am I here? How's this going to work? But eventually, you know, a little more English crept in and we really started learning the language. It was intensive. It was somewhere around 9 hours of instruction per day. I would have 2.5 hours of study hall every evening, and then sometimes I would have study hall on Saturdays. We usually got Sunday to ourselves, and that lasted for a year.
A year. Was it? Did it like immerse you in the culture as well, or?
I wouldn't call it immersion, but it was language and culture training, right? So primarily language, but we did have culture classes. This is what, you know, this is Korean culture, this is Korean history, this is, you know, things like food and religion, and then some of the sort of cultural drivers of Korean life that are significantly different from the West. So we learned a lot about that.
So at this point in time, you've been in the Marine Corps a year and a half or so around this time.
Oh, roughly, yeah.
Yeah. So what were they training you to be? A linguist?
Well, it was primarily I was training to be an intelligence specialist.
Okay.
To work against, you know, if I say I was learning the Korean language, I don't have to tell you what my target nation was, and so that's what it was. And so I worked primarily during my active duty career in signals intelligence. So that was working in communications intelligence and that kind of thing.
So where did you go after language school?
After language school, there's a follow-on school, 5-ish months, something like that, in San Angelo, Texas, Southwest Texas, at Goodfellow Air Force Base. It's the Air Force's primary intelligence training base. And so I went there for 4 or 5 months. In language school, that was just all unclassified work. That was just learning the language, learning the culture. The follow-on school was where you learned basically the intelligence side of what you were going to be doing, where you were indoctrinated into classified operations, doing that type of work. And so I did that. So I was there for about 5 months.
Tell me about Goodfellow. What was that like?
Well, I have a long history with Goodfellow because that was the first of 4 trips for me to Goodfellow. So that was the first school I went through there. I went through 3 schools and then eventually went back and became an instructor in one of those schools. Actually, in the school, I became an instructor teaching that course, that first course that I went through much later. I liked it, you know, San Angelo. It was certainly not Monterey, California. Monterey, California is a beautiful place. You know, Carmel, 17-mile drive, Pebble Beach is all right there in your backyard. The Defense Language Institute actually sits on some of probably the most expensive real estate that the DoD, the Department of Defense, owns. It's on a hilltop that overlooks Monterey Bay. On a clear day, you can see Santa Cruz across the bay. It's absolutely stunning. San Angelo is not much like that. It is quasi-desert, Southwest Texas. What I remember the most about San Angelo were the people, like the people of San Angelo, not the military people, but just your regular citizens in San Angelo. Very happy to have us there. You know, it's Texas, so they're a little more friendly, I guess, to the concept of the military than you might get on the central coast of California. So the people were great. You know, again, it was a lot of hard work training. Your class starts at 6 a.m. You know, so and during all of that, you're still maintaining, you know, even through the language school and that, you know, all that training, you're still maintaining all of the other standards that you're required to maintain. So physical fitness and you know, military training type things that were in addition to the academic stuff that you were learning.
So since boot camp, has there been any instructors at either the language school or at Goodfellow that stand out to you?
I remember a lot of my instructors actually I remember everybody. So at language school, we had a cadre of native language instructors. Interestingly, some of them were North Korean. But not recently North Korean. They had left there, decades before. And then we also had what we called a military language instructor, and this was someone who was a military person who was a very good linguist, very good at the language, who would come in and teach us as well. My military language instructor I actually ran into years later in Korea. He had retired, and I ran into him at a restaurant. He had moved back to Korea. He was married to a Korean woman, and he'd moved back to Korea, and he was working there as I don't know if he was a contractor or working for the government, but yeah. So he was a great guy. And then at the language school, or at Goodfellow later on, I remember my instructor for a different reason, because he was not exactly, not every Marine is a stellar Marine, let's put it that way. And so he had a little issue with donuts, so he had a little weight problem. And he was struggling to be a good Marine, let's put it that way. Not a bad instructor, but on the Marine Corps side, he left a little bit to be desired. So, as you go through your life, as you go through your career, you develop role models, and you develop positive role models, and you develop examples of people that you don't want to be like. And those can be as powerful as a positive role model. This guy was one of those latter category. I don't want to be like that guy. Yeah.
So was there any more training or schools after that?
No, after Goodfellow, I reported to my first duty station. It was 1st Radio Battalion in Kaneohe, Hawaii. Throughout my entire, so I was in the Marine Corps for 13 years. I can't complain about a single duty station. They sent me to Monterey, California. They sent me to Korea. They sent me to Hawaii. So I think I would be remiss to complain about the duty assignments. So I went to Hawaii, reported for 1st Radio Battalion. It was a 3-year assignment. I wound up spending right around 3 years. However, I wasn't there very much. I did a lot of what we'll call, some of them were deployments. A lot of it was training exercises. So this is by then it's 1994, late 94, early 95. Geopolitically, there wasn't a lot going on. We'd just, won the first Gulf War. We had just won the Cold War. There wasn't much to do, to be honest. So there was a lot of training.
What were some of these deployments?
Some of it was related to equipment, so I got involved in testing field equipment, new equipment that was coming out. There was also in the early 1990s, great technological innovations were happening very rapidly, and that was translating into new tools for us to do what we did. And so there was a lot of development and testing of that equipment, a lot of computer-based stuff. I also went to Korea a few times on short deployments to work with the Koreans. Spent some time on the DMZ. And then the longest deployment I did was with 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit, or MEU, 31st MEU, out of Okinawa. And so, let's see, that would have been, I was in the late 90s, I don't remember the exact dates. The way that worked, it was my sea duty, so on a ship. We went to Okinawa, we did 2 months of what you call workups. So that's getting everybody, training up to be qualified to do the missions that you could be assigned to do as a Marine Expeditionary Unit. So the Marine Expeditionary Unit is like the quick reaction force for the whatever fleet commander you happen to be working under. I think that's 7th Fleet out there. I might be wrong on that, but anyway. So you did 2 months of essentially training and qualification, and then we did 2 months afloat, and then 2 months back in Okinawa, sort of pre-positioned, staged, ready to react if we needed to go somewhere. It was actually a money-saving technique for the Department of Defense to it was much cheaper to put us on dry land and pre-position the boat and the materials and the supplies to react as it was to have us floating around. It's really expensive to have those ships out there. So that's what I did.
What ship were you on?
I was on the mighty warship Bellawood, the USS Bellawood, which has since been decommissioned and is now probably being turned into razor blades. It was what's called an LHA, which is an amphibious assault ship. So there was a squadron of helicopters and Harriers, jump jets. Complement on the Bellawood, I think it was around 1,500 sailors and about 2,000 or 2,200 Marines, something like that. And then we had support ships, and I can neither confirm nor deny that there would be a submarine attached to us under certain conditions, under certain operations. That yeah, there would be a sub that would be conducting operations underneath us, I guess. Yeah.
What was life like at sea?
Yeah, that took some getting used to. It was a lot of work. You have downtime, but there's nothing to do on downtime, so you wind up just working. And I worked in a special section of the ship, in a special room, where we had access to a lot more information than most of the people on the ship. So you don't know, I mean, you basically have your day-to-day job on a ship, and that's what you do. And you don't have, there's not a lot of access to outside information. Probably more now than there was then. We had no information, but we had insight because we were able to read reporting and intelligence reporting on things that were happening. And so we had an idea of what we were doing and where we were going, probably more than anybody else on the ship.
So this time you were stationed in Hawaii and doing one of these various deployments. What was the next step after Hawaii?
Well, so every time I went from one duty station to another, I went back through Goodfellow. The reason for that was I had no official duty stations inside the continental United States. There had been some slots at Fort Meade in Maryland. However, those were transitioned out to Hawaii. So I had in my job field, I could be stationed in Hawaii or Korea at that time. And so for certain things, Hawaii was considered overseas, and for certain other things, it was considered continental United States, or CONUS. And for a specific incentive, a reenlistment incentive, service incentive, called Consecutive Overseas Tour, or COT, Hawaii was considered overseas. And the way COT worked was if you went from one overseas assignment directly to another overseas assignment, you would be compensated for that. And the two types of compensation you could choose, which one you wanted, was actual monetary, so basically cut you a check, or you could get free leave. You could get free vacation time. But there was a catch. If you transited the continental United States during your move, even for one day, even if it was a layover on a flight, you weren't eligible for the COT incentive. And so to save a little bit of money for my job field, every Korean linguist Marine that transitioned from one overseas assignment to another during that time got a school en route at Goodfellow, which is in Texas, which was in the continental United States. So I never got a COT incentive for every single overseas to overseas assignment. So the first school I went back to was called Analysis and Reporting Course, again at Goodfellow. And basically an advanced course for my job. And that lasted, I want to say it was about 5 months. From there, well, I can tell you that at the end of my tour, my first tour in Hawaii, I was pretty sure I was going to leave the service. I was getting out. I was done. I'd done a tour. And they offered me a choice of duty station and a reenlistment bonus. And I took it. It was too good of an opportunity to pass up not because of the bonus, although that was nice, but because of the choice of duty assignment. And the next duty assignment that I chose, was eligible to choose, was in Korea. And so I went to Korea for a year, working in an office that's a field side of a national agency. And so that sort of, my first assignment in Radio Battalion in Hawaii was it would be tactical. It was very much, support to operational teams. So the way that worked was we were a small team of intel folks, let's put it that way, who would be surreptitiously attached to a combat arms unit that would be conducting operations. Normally something like artillery, tankers, amphibious assault, very rarely foot infantry, mostly because it was just too hard for us to move with them. Most of the time, those combat infantrymen or the combat arms people had no idea we were there. Maybe the intelligence officer, their commanding officer knew we were there, but we were sort of, we call them hide sites. We were away from them doing what we did. And so when I went to, that was a very tactical mission. When I went to Korea, my job was an indications and warning analyst, and so primarily focused on North Korean Special Operations Forces. And so my job was to monitor North Korean military activity as a desk analyst and look for any indications of hostilities, right? So, you know, the great fear at that time was a invasion or some kind of a incursion, and so that's what I was watching for, and I did that for a year.
And nuclear weapons were not on the table.
Nuclear weapons. This was 1998, and so they had a weapons program at that time. It was not very well established. The bigger concern for us was that was right around the time that they were becoming proficient with their intercontinental, a missile program. They weren't at the ICBM level then. That was their first sort of go round with missile technology, the Taepodong missile, a two-stage ballistic missile, and so that was what was really interest of the sort of National Command Authority of the United States.
What was life like in Korea?
I really enjoyed Korea. Obviously, speaking the language, I had a leg up on most U.S. GIs over there. And you know, having been trained in culture and language, it was a lot easier for me to sort of get around outside of base. And so there were days, I had a really strange work schedule because we obviously, as a INW analyst, you do that 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and so we had a rotating shift schedule. My schedule was a little strange, and so there were days when I wouldn't be working in the middle of the week, and so I would just take the subway map of Seoul, pick a spot, and just jump on the train and go there. Well, you know, far away from where most GIs would venture, and would walk around and talk to people and eat and shop, and so it was interesting. It was a lot of fun.
Were you married at the time? Did you bring family?
No, not at that time. So I met my future wife there at Goodfellow in the analysis and reporting course. She was in the Air Force. And then we dated during that time, and then when I left San Angelo to go to Korea, she left San Angelo to go to Augusta, Georgia, Fort Gordon, Georgia. And so we sort of did the long distance relationship thing for 6 months. I flew from Korea to Georgia. We got married on my, what we call a mid-tour leave. I got a 20 days of leave in the middle of my year-long assignment. We got married, went on our honeymoon, were together about 10 days, and then I flew back to Korea for another 6 months. So the first 6 months of our marriage was about 7,000 miles apart. And you know, we think that if you can survive that, then the rest of the marriage is going to be easy. So
just a lot of long phone calls. And
so that was yeah. So that we were probably responsible for at least a couple of cents increase in AT&T stock at that time. A very significant phone bills. Most of my paycheck was going to phone bills. Yeah.
So what came after Korea?
Let's see. After Korea, back to Goodfellow, where I went through this would have been round 3 at Goodfellow. I went through the cryptanalysis course, so I became a cryptanalyst, which is breaking codes. That was about a 6-month course. I say DLI was the most challenging academically, but this was right up there. It was different type of challenge, but definitely just as intellectually challenging. And there's a high attrition rate through that course. Over 50% don't complete it. It's since they don't have that course anymore, but at that time it was like 60-something% didn't complete the course. I made it. Then back to Hawaii after that, where I went to what was then called the Kinea Regional Security Operations Center, the KRSOC, which has since been named to NSA CSS Hawaii. It is a field site for the National Security Agency in Hawaii. It's an interesting place because it is underground. It's 4 stories underneath about 50 feet of dirt. It was built during World War II in Hawaii, on Oahu, shortly after Pearl Harbor. And so the concern was that obviously Hawaii was susceptible to Japanese bombing at the time, and so they started to harden their structures. One of the things that they did, this was originally built as an aircraft manufacturing plant, so it was big. And they built it in the bottom of a steep valley, and then they covered it with dirt. And so it was flat across the top. And there's a very long tunnel that goes in from a huge blast door that goes down somewhere between 1/4 and 1/2 of a mile before you get to the front door. And so it is euphemistically referred to as the tunnel. So I went to work at the tunnel, stayed there for 3 years.
What was your job like there?
It was very much a desk job. So the first part of that, I was doing cryptanalytic work. And then that mission migrated back to Fort Meade, Maryland, and I couldn't go with it. So they transitioned me into more of a conventional sort of signals intelligence analyst work.
Did you take your wife along on this tour?
Yeah, so she was there. We had 2 kids while we were there. So while we were there, she transitioned out of the Air Force. At that time, if a female service member, Air Force, got pregnant, they could elect to take an administrative separation from service. And so she did. And so she was out, completely out for about a year, maybe a year and a half, something like that. And then we had 2 kids during that time. And then toward the end of my tour there, she went back into the reserves, into the Air Force Reserves.
So what was life like being in Hawaii? You were there before, but...
Yeah, so that's interesting. There were 2, I did 2 assignments in Hawaii, both 3 years, and they were completely different. The first one, I was young and single and deployed almost constantly. I mean, there was one point where I was returning from, it was actually the 31st MEU. I was returning from the 31st MEU. I flew into Honolulu International Airport. We got off the plane, and standing there was the company commander and the company clerk. It wasn't unusual for the commander to be there because they would often show up at the airport to welcome people back from deployments. It was strange that the clerk was there, and he was holding a manila envelope. And I've heard this, similar type stories from other service members, but that manila envelope was holding my orders, my tickets, me and myself and another Marine to go, and they said, literally, go get your bags off of that carousel, go over to that desk and check them in. Your flight leaves in 4 hours. We're not taking you back across the island. You're just going to wait here. So I flew straight to California. So that wasn't too bad, to Camp Pendleton for a short assignment, and then back to Hawaii. So that was, the first experience. Was almost never in Hawaii. If I was there, I was only there for a couple of months or a few weeks at a time, and then back out again. The second time, married, essentially a desk job in a cubicle farm, young kids, babies. So it was a lot different. Yeah, it was mostly just work and kids. Yeah.
What was the next step after this assignment in Hawaii?
Well, I went through that assignment in Hawaii was when September 11th happened.
Okay.
And so everything changed after September 11th. I mean, I was working in intelligence, but I was working North Korean mission, and so in Hawaii, September 11th, in New York, it was like 9 o'clock in the morning. In Hawaii, it's like 6 o'clock, or it's 3 o'clock in the morning. That's what it was. And so we got a phone call, my wife and I got a phone call, and we woke up, turned on the TV, and that was right about the time the second plane went in. And so the last part of my assignment in Hawaii was leading up to the invasion of Afghanistan, and then the initial stages of the invasion of Afghanistan, and I didn't have much to do. because I was a Korean linguist and I was a cryptanalyst, and nobody needed, the Mujahideen wasn't exactly using a lot of codes. So I got kind of, we call it being farmed out. I was moved off the assignment that I was working on to go work on with a special group that was looking for a New York Times reporter who'd been kidnapped at that time, a guy named Daniel Pearl, who we weren't successful. He was killed. So that was kind of where that all started. So my assignment after, and there were a lot of people who were deploying at that point, who were being, signed up, off they went. And I wasn't. That was, what are you going to do over there? You're a Korean linguist. There's not much for you to do. And I kept asking my commanding officer, hey, it's my turn. I'm going to go. He's like, no, you're not going to go. To the point where in an all-hands call with, we had a visitor come in, a distinguished visitor. It was the director of Marine Corps Intelligence, a guy named General Ennis, who then later on went to work at the CIA. But at that time, he was director of all Marine Corps Intelligence, and he did an all-hands, he talked, and then there was supposed to be a question and answer session, and in the Marine Corps, question and answer session is a highly regulated event. And I stood up and asked him if he could facilitate a deployment for me. And he said no. He asked me what my job was, and I told him I'm a Korean linguist. And he said something very smart. He said, son, we need you doing what you're doing because they're not going away. Fair enough. But I did notice that he shot a glance over at my commanding officer. My commanding officer then shot a glance to the first sergeant. And so I knew what I was in for later, but it was worth it. And I got it later. Interestingly, that commanding officer is now the current director of Marine Corps Intelligence, a guy named Seeley, Bill Seeley, General Seeley, who I kind of keep in contact with. So I give you all that to kind of lay the groundwork for where I went next, which was not to fight the war. It was back to Goodfellow to teach the Korean language basic course. And so that's where I spent the next almost 3 years as an instructor at Goodfellow, watching those guys because they weren't going away. Yeah.
So what was it like being an instructor now at Goodfellow?
After 3 experiences as a student, being an instructor was sweet revenge. I say that because I got to call shots that I never got to call before. I really got a taste for teaching there. I learned how to be a teacher, and I got in front of a classroom, and I really enjoyed it, and I continue to do it to this day as a side job. But it was great. It was working with young folks who were coming into the job field that I was a part of and had been a part of at that point for a decade or so. And it was a good experience. It was good for my family because it was safe. It was, I was safe. I wasn't, my wife was happy that I wasn't, overseas somewhere not safe or not as safe as I was sitting in, a comfy chair in San Angelo, Texas. So there's really not much to talk about there. I mean, it was teaching and training, and that's all.
Was that your final assignment, or?
No, I had one assignment after that. So I went from there. I went back to Korea, to the same place I've been before. But I took a more senior role where I had been a desk analyst before. I went back and became the watch officer who was in charge of all the desk analysts. And so I was still an indications and warning specialist. That was my job. But I was in charge of all of the different analysts that were on the floor. We actually we were integrated into a Korean facility. And so we worked in their facility, and we augmented the Korean analysts, the South Korean military analysts, with our people, sort of sitting alongside, working together. And so I had a counterpart. So I was the U.S. watch officer, and there was a South Korean watch officer who was my counterpart. Big watch floor, and we each had offices at the end that looked out through a big glass window that looked out over the watch floor. So that's what I did there.
Was there any other deployments or anything during this time? Or
No. When I was in Korea, it was I was back on the same strange schedule. We referred to it as a 2-2-96. And so the way that worked was I would work 2 12-hour day shifts from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. And in the middle, you would flip to two 12-hour mid shifts from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. And then you'd have 4 days off, 96 hours off, and then you'd do it again. And it was just a constant rotation.
Were you able to take your family with you this time?
No, that was a unaccompanied assignment. It was just me for a year.
So what led to your decision to leave the Marine Corps?
Well, during my time, the second tour in Hawaii, where I worked in the tunnel, you know, I worked in a cubicle farm, I've said that, I worked at a desk, but we were still required to maintain our military training, our tactical training, and so there were, you know, annual requirements to go to the field and do tactical training and qualify on firearms, rifle and pistol, and all those types of things that we had to do in addition to the desk job that you're working on. And so during a field exercise, training exercise, I had an unfortunate incident with a fast rope rappel, which is it's a type of rappelling where you basically hang a really big, thick rope down out of a helicopter, and then you slide down it like a fire pole. Most people have seen this in movies and things. And I landed wrong. I had a heavy rock or a pack on my back, and I injured my back. Actually, what I found out later was I injured my hip and my back. And I knew that it hurt when I did it, but you don't really, I mean, if you can still walk, you can still train, right? And so I continued doing what I was doing, and it got steadily worse over the next, few years, to the point where by the time I got to what turned out to be my last assignment, my second assignment in Korea, by that time I'd been going to doctors and they'd been trying to figure out what was going on. A lot of tests, a lot of MRIs, and a lot of evaluation, and they couldn't really figure out what was going on. And so it was not really possible for me to continue the physical training that was required. And so I decided to transition out. So I left after 13 years.
Okay. What does your family, either back at home and your immediate family, your wife and kids, think about this?
About just getting out?
Getting out, or what was the transition more or less like?
Oh, so what was the transition like? Well, it wasn't that bad. I mean, for starters, I wasn't a combat veteran. So a lot of the transition issues that combat veterans face, I just don't have, because I never experienced that. I will say, though, that the work that I did, though it was remote, it was from a distance. Let's say that I could watch what was happening through video feeds. And that presents a unique challenge of its own, because you're watching what's happening and you're trying to influence things in a positive way for the people that you're watching that are on your side. But there's really not much you can do directly. And so that's difficult to essentially watch people die, and there's nothing you can do. So that was challenging, but not, I would say, nowhere near the as challenging, let's say, as the people who were there, right? So I don't equate myself to that. So for me, the transition to civilian life wasn't as challenging, wasn't as bad. I mean, we moved here to Dayton. My wife's sister's husband, my brother-in-law, is from around this area, and so we wound up back here so that the sisters could be near each other. And so, started working, basically doing the same thing I was doing. And we've been here since 2006.
What kind of work did you end up doing after the Marine Corps, or did you go back to school?
No, well, yes. While I was in, I accumulated 2 associate's degrees and finished my bachelor's degree, GI Bill, or tuition assistance and some GI Bill. And then when I got out, I came here to Dayton. I immediately started as a defense contractor, basically doing the same thing I was doing, intel work at Wright-Patterson, and started going to graduate school GI Bill. And I figured if I had it, I should use it. And so finished up a master's degree here at Wright State. And then I've been basically defense contracting since then, sort of worked my way up from an analyst. Now I just sort of manage some of those programs. And once I finished my master's degree, I thought, what the heck? There's a little bit of GI Bill money left, so I started a doctorate. And I'm continuing very slowly to work on that. Hobby doctorate is what I call it. Yeah, so that's where I'm at now.
Do you still work as a North Korean analyst? You sat on the North Korean panel here at Wright State a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, so I still, I don't work directly as an analyst on any current mission. However, I maintain currency on North Korean issues. I work with other academics who are working on geopolitical issues related to North Korea, military, security, those types of things. So I still kind of keep myself in the game. That has lately, due to some, the nuclear tests and the blustering and all of that stuff that's going on with North Korea right now. Who knows where that's going to go. So I've been asked to provide some of my insight into the situation and what might happen, where it might go. So I sat on a panel here at Wright State. I actually am being interviewed later today on North Korean security issues. Probably going to do another talk at Air Force Research Labs on North Korean geopolitics. So that kind of, just because of my background and what's going on now, has sort of given me an opportunity to reinvigorate on North Korea.
And what led to your teaching gig here at Wright State?
So I went through the Public Administration Master's Degree Program, MPA, and because of my affiliation with the base, with Wright-Patt, the department chair and the program chair asked to meet with me to discuss possible opportunities for them to more effectively engage the population at Wright-Patt to help try to recruit them into the program. And so I met with both of them, and in the course of that meeting, they offered me an opportunity to adjunct, teach one of the classes in the program, which I agreed to do, and then that since developed into now teaching 3 classes, 1 per term. And so that's how that started, and I enjoy it. It's great to be in a classroom. I really enjoy being in front of the students and hearing myself talk. So that's always a bonus for me.
Do you still keep in contact with any of your friends from the Marine Corps or in the service?
I do. I'm not big into social media, but through social media, what little social media I do have, yeah, it's a lot easier to keep in contact with people. Like I said, I keep in contact with an old commanding officer who's now Director of Marine Corps Intelligence. That offered me an opportunity. So a few years ago, prior to him taking on the job that he has now, as a colonel, he was the director of Marine Corps Intelligence Schools. And so that offered me an opportunity to go out and see him and kind of collaborate on some things that I was working on with him. And I wouldn't have had that opportunity had I not been in contact with him on LinkedIn. And I wouldn't have even known that's what he was doing. That's where he was. So it's a lot easier to keep in contact with folks today, just because you're able to do that digitally, electronically.
Are you part of any veterans organizations?
Not officially, yeah, VFW or AMVETS or anything like that. I've considered it, and honestly, it's just I've been too busy. I will be honest. I've been too busy and too lazy to really get involved. So I don't really participate in any of the veterans organizations.
Would you recommend the Marine Corps to anybody who might ask what branch of service they should?
I would not recommend the Marine Corps to just anybody. And here's why. Because I saw too many people who were just anybody give it a try and fail. My nephew just joined the Marine Corps, and he's a sharp kid, and he's doing well. He's been meritoriously promoted to every rank that he now holds. And I looked at him, and before he went in, I said, that kid's going to do great. He's going to be good. He's going to be good for it. I don't think it's for everybody. I think it's good if somebody wants to challenge themselves to see if they can do it. But the truth is, not everybody can, and not everybody should. I can say that it was great for me. I'm not sure that someone would have looked at me the day before I went to the Marine Corps and said, yeah, that guy would be good. But maybe they would have, I don't know. So, yeah, I would suggest it to anybody that wants to challenge themselves. But if you're not interested in a challenge, try something else. Yeah.
All right, so wrapping up here, what message would you like to leave for future generations, millennials, who might be viewing this interview?
Wow, what message would I like to leave? So one of the earliest influences, and I didn't mention this when I talked about joining the Marine Corps, was a guy named Jim Klulo. He was my high school history teacher. He was a Marine veteran, Korean War, and he's still alive today. He's in his 80s and delivers Meals on Wheels. He's the guy that should be getting the meal delivered, but he's actually the guy that's out there doing it in his probably mid to late 80s now. So the message I would leave is that what's significant about military service is that you stand on the shoulders of giants. The people that came before you, we respect them. We respect the things that they did and accomplished. And so it's not a way to get college money. It's not just something to do because you didn't have anything else to do. That may be why people initially join. That's fine. But once you get in there and you get into the life and you get into the culture, that's what you leave with. That's what I left with.
All right. Is there any last alibis, anything we didn't talk about that you might want to add to this interview?
No, I think that's about it.
All right, I have one last question in lieu of quantitative research class. If you could be a statistic, what statistic would you be and why?
I would be an oak tree. No, what statistic would I be? What do you mean by statistic? I think you're going to have to be...
It's just, I mean, you teach statistics in a way, so...
I think the most important thing for me in my life is that I get to say I'm a Marine.
All right. Well, Professor Martin, thank you for your service. I appreciate you doing this interview. And that concludes the interview of Christopher Martin.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Appreciate it.
Did I throw you off the Barbara Walters question?
No, but I got the oak tree piece. 'Cause that's what she answered.
Yeah. I've done that like almost every interview since we had that conversation.
Yeah.
I'll just ask a random question. That's,
If you could be any
and
tree.
people are like, what, huh? Because usually it's the message for future generations. It's like really throws them off guard and they have to like really think hard about it. And then I throw them the last one and, oh, okay.
Right.